Today I chat with Josh Bongard and Michael Levin, who are the co-directors of this really crazy center called the Institute for Computationally Designed Organisms. And this is part of our series on how we're going to rewrite all of biology in the biosphere. And Michael and Josh are maybe the most futuristic about it of all of my conversations. One idea that really stuck with me that you'll learn about today is this idea of morphology space, which is that there's lots of physical possibilities for how animals and robots can exist. There's, cats and pine trees. There's like robots, like drones that are around. But we've really only explored a small part of morphology design space thus far. Right now, everything around us is just from natural selection from Earth from 4 billion years. But in the next 100 plus years, we're going to create a bunch of crazy different organisms that exist, organisms and robots all around us, not just from natural selection, but from AI and other things. And so we're going to live in this new kind of Men in Black reality where everything around us is not just humans and the plants and animals we're used to, but also are all these computationally designed organisms. And that will be a crazy future. So we chat about that and many other things. Hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, listeners. My name is Rhys and I'm the founder of Root, and welcome to The Rhys Show. And today, I'm excited to chat with two amazing folks. We have Josh Bongard and Michael Levin, and they're these co-directors of this really cool new institute, the Institute for Computationally Designed Organisms, which is, you may have guessed it, a research center for organisms that are computationally designed. So we're going to chat a lot about that today. Josh and Michael, thanks for being on the show and welcome.
Thanks for having us, Rhys.
Woohoo! Your thank yous were roughly at the same time, which is perfect. And by the way, this is one of my first this is a 3-person interview, so this will be kind of fun to see us all kind of navigate this. You all are kind of two halves of the same brain / maybe 1.5 brains each for 3 brains total. I'm not sure how to do the math, but so we'll explore that today. Before we dive into some of those computationally designed organisms, I guess I want to ask each of you, you each have this weird perspective of both the computational side, but also the biology side. And maybe starting with Josh, what is like the through line that ties all of your work together?
So all of the work that goes on in my lab falls under this heading of AI-driven design. If we turn over some of the increasingly exotic creatures and systems and buildings and bridges and materials that our society is designing, it's getting harder and harder for a human engineer to figure out how to do it. So let's see what an AI comes up with.
Got it. Cool. So it's like, let's point the AI at the design and have them make it. I'm not very good at designing stuff, so let's have the AI do it. And then Michael, for you, what's the through line that ties all of your work together?
Yeah, basically everything that we do in my group, and some of which is bench biology and some of which is theory and so on, is fundamentally, it's all about understanding how it happens that some physical things in the universe have minds. So I'm really interested in intelligence. I want to know how scaling works in terms of competency, how small subunits like cells or other things, we're all bags of cells, right? We have this unified perspective, but we're really a collection of various cells, some of which are neurons. And so how does that happen? And what kind of bodies can exist? What kind of minds can inhabit those bodies? All those kinds of questions.
Interesting. And so it's like Josh is the designing side, and then Michael, it sounds like yours is almost more of almost like an understanding side, where it's like, how does the mind work or something? Is that correct?
I mean, that's certainly part of it. The thing is that what keeps us honest in terms of how do we know whether any of our theories are any good is that our outputs are at least supposed to be advances in regenerative medicine.
Cool.
So my lab is trying to understand the collective intelligence of cells, for example. And if we knew what we were doing, we would have good theories about how to make these cells do what we want them to do. So that would be the equivalent of the design, sort of side, right?
Got it. Cool. Yeah, I like the and for me as a person, I was at the MIT Media Lab for a bit, but I never really fit in there in the sense that I was like, it's too academic for me. And so it's like, for me, when I hear more applied research center, I get more excited, just the applied side I get more excited about. So the other kind of funny thing with your collaboration with the two of you is that you're collaborating in this way where you got kind of a biologist, Michael, and then kind of a computer science, Josh. How did you all start to collaborate together, and what has that looked like?
Mike, do you want to tell our origin story?
Sure, yeah. So I've been following Josh's work for since the beginning. I thought it was amazing, and I thought it was exactly what we needed in biology. And I think our first actual sort of encounter was I put on this little conference. Um, and invited four or five people that I thought were really doing breakthrough things that I thought could lead to something big. And so that's the first time we met in person. But I've been following the work for forever.
And
And
I
you,
obviously knew about Mike's work as well. And as a roboticist and someone who works in the AI space, we're obviously always bio inspired, right? Trying to borrow ideas from nature to make smarter robots and AI. And as I learned more about Mike's work and looked at the work that they were doing, it wasn't necessarily that they were viewing organisms as raw materials to learn hypotheses, was also treating them as machines or agents in and of their own right, creating these crazy animals and organisms that had never existed on earth before. It didn't look that different from what roboticists and researchers in AI were trying to do. And the more I learned about Mike's work, this distinction between biology and computer science started to blur. And that line's become blurrier the further we've collaborated together.
yeah, I love that. It's funny. It's like, well, I think so much of it is just these like weird little terms. Like the phrasing, the framing at the beginning has all kinds of downstream effects. Where it's like just framing, the biological units as agents or machines makes you think about them in a different way instead of like thinking of it as some kind of like an organism or something. And then also it makes me think, yeah, I mean, it's like this underlying perspective of, as we've learned about obviously DNA, like 50, 75 years ago. And it's like, okay, what are yeah, everything is just kind of computationally driven information processors, and so like you can look at it from one perspective or the other, but that's kind of what it's turtles all the way down. So thinking about specifically what the work that you all are doing now, which is and to kind of frame it both for the audience and for you all, I kind of think of this like the goal for the audience is to help them understand kind of how synthetic biology might impact their daily life and also society as a whole in the coming decades. And so, with that in mind, could one of you two kind of maybe, Michael, do you just want to explain what is a Xenobot and what is this Institution for Computationally Designed Organisms?
Yeah. So maybe let's take a step back and start with what you were just saying about how it's going to impact people's lives, right? So one thing to understand is that pretty much every problem in medicine, with perhaps the exception of infectious disease. So we're talking about birth defects, we're talking about traumatic injuries, so losing limbs, cancer, degenerative disease, aging. All of these things would go away and be completely resolvable if we knew the answer to the following question: how do collections of cells decide what they're going to build? Right? Because if we could convince cells to build new organs, all of this stuff would be solved. So what keeps so for people listening to this, right? You're all going to get older. We're all going to experience
Oh
various
no!
various issues. Yeah, and unfortunately, um, and what keeps us from really radical advances in regenerative medicine is really fundamental knowledge gaps about this question, right? And it's kind of widely believed, and biologists perpetuate this by our developmental biology textbooks, let's say, make it sound like all of this is solved, right? You have this beautiful textbooks where everything, it looks like that by paying attention to the genetics and to the molecular biology, that we've kind of have a handle on this stuff, right? And we can dig into this, but I'm here to tell you that we don't have a handle on it. There are major major questions that are completely deep areas of deep ignorance. And what we need to understand is not just the hardware of life, or the materials of which it's made, and how how all the little proteins and pathways and everything else to act, but actually how do they know what to do, the informational side of things. And so what I hope this institute is going to do is use the medium of synthetic morphology, meaning we're not just going to look at the few examples that life has given us as these evolved like standards model species, which is what all developmental biology has been doing. We're going to make new ones, because we all know that by making by making things from scratch, you learn about what's going on and how much you understand it. And we're really going to crack what I think of as the software of life, right? The really important addition to in addition to understanding how all the mechanisms work, how do the algorithms work? How do any of these things know what to do, right? What's the information? What's the computation? And then what are the interventions? How do we get it to do what we want it to do? So that's what I hope this institute will do.
Yeah, and let me pause you for a second. That's a great overview, and I love the kind of, it's kind of an interesting thing where it's like, yeah, we have in our bodies, everything is degenerating, and it's like, oh, what if we use these induced pluripotent stem cells or whatever to like make a new retina or something? It's like, let's just like rebuild the things, these collections of cells to like build new things for ourselves. And it's so interesting. I think that like part of, I think, a really powerful perspective that you both bring here is this idea that we have. It's kind of funny because, yeah, we have like the DNA, which builds the protein, and then the protein goes and like does something, but how does it know what to do? You know, like where is it? Like, what is that? Like, I think that there's something in this kind of like information processing piece, which is really interesting. And as you said there, Michael, it's like, how do we, trying to understand our bodies is so complicated because they kind of evolved over, 4 billion years or whatever, versus just like, let's like treat this in a lab and just do some synthetic morphology. So that all kind of makes sense to me. Is there, and then maybe, Josh, how does the Xenobot kind of fit into that vision of, synthetic morphology?
So as you were just saying, right, it's comfortable to sort of say, well, let's just decide that genes encode this part of the body and that part of the body, and we'll write this nice textbook, and okay, I feel better. It's very intuitive, very simple. There's some details to figure out. And as Mike mentioned, it is definitely not that. So what do we do if we want to achieve, these goals that Mike has mentioned? How do we design? How do we intervene? Where do we push? Where do we press? Where do we twist? This is something that I and my students have thought about for a long time. You need to bring in one of the most recent tools that humans have invented, this thing called AI, which maybe, and this is still not proved, that maybe it can figure out some of these interventions better. Maybe it can build from cells and tissues and blood vessels and genes and bioelectric networks in the way that humans built with concrete and metal and plastics and ceramics and electronics in the 20th century. We're moving into this space where the materials are extremely powerful. They are competent, as Mike can tell you. They do things on their own, and we're not quite sure what they will do under what conditions. They are not dead materials like steel and plastic and electronics that will just sit there until we push them into modules and get them to do what they want. This is living and lively material, and building stuff from that. I think we're going to need some help.
Cool.
I mean, one of the funny things that a lot of people don't think about is, developmental biology has some beautiful work over many decades, right? But if Josh were to call me up and he would say, yeah, you're a developmental biologist. I want a robot that grows its leg back. Can you point me to something in this textbook that's going to help me out with this? There's literally nothing. There is almost nothing in a developmental biology textbook that I could hand over to someone and say, here, this, you can use this to make something that does something. That's, to me, that's a major gap here, right? We should be, our goal should be to pull out these general engineering principles where somebody could say, oh, I see, so I should do this, this, and this, and then I'll have, instead we the best we can do is hand over a list of genes. And he would say, well, where's the magic? Is it these ones? I'm like, nah, not really. It really kind of doesn't matter what any of them are. And then what do we have, right? So that's where I think there's a major opportunity here, is to actually understand, get the information that's needed to cross fertilize these fields.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, it's like, as you said, it's like hey, I want to build this, and we know the genes are very simple in some way. It's like, blue eye, brown eye. You can do like some simple things like that, but then when it gets to these more complex kind of physical things, it's like, yeah, we have no idea. So talking about a Xenobot for a second, and for our listeners, it's kind of, just to give you the TLDR here, it's kind of it's these beautiful little creatures where you say, okay, we want this little creature to, it's made of a frog skin cells and heart cells. And you say, hey, let's like design this little creature. It's very small. It has a bunch of these little cells. You make it in the kind of the wet lab, and then it can go around like do stuff like push the plastic into like a little circle, or like do like move a little thing somewhere, kind of like run around. Is that, and it's weird because it's this little thing that kind of looks like an organism, but it's not. It's like it's designed by Michael and Josh, and really by the AI. And so is that right? Is that what a Xenobot is? Did I kind of get it right?
I mean, physically, that's what it is. It's a new proto-organism made from skin cells or skin and muscle cells. But I think the more significant piece of this is this: if I were to ask you, what do the skin cells of a frog embryo want to do? Right. Usually, you'll get two answers. Either that's a stupid question, nothing, they don't want to do anything, or well, what they want to do is to be a nice two-dimensional outer layer on a tadpole and keep out the bacteria, because that's what evolution has evolved them for, right? What the Xenobots are an experimental answer to this question that tells us that both of those are wrong. What happens is if you take those cells and we don't add anything, we don't add new genes, we don't edit their genome, we don't add nanomaterials, we don't do any of this weird stuff. What we do is we liberate them from the instructive influence of the other cells. And we really ask them, okay, what do you want to do? You're off by yourself. You're in this novel environment. What do you want to do? And it turns out that actually what they will actually do when they're not forced into this kind of boring two-dimensional, surfacey life, they actually want to be this other organism that runs around and does interesting things. And then it turns out and Josh will explain all this, we can use AI to actually manipulate that process and get them to do slightly other things, right? So we can start to play the role of, evolution had how many, millions of years to figure out how to get the other cells to sort of beat them into submission to be skin. But now we're starting to, we want to pull back. So the idea is, let's pull back and say, what is the default that they would like to do? And this is the default. It's amazing. Nobody would have guessed this, right? And then say, okay, now can we do the other thing, which is to figure out how to get them to do something else. So what they really are a technology that is starting to show us how to really understand what's behind this collective intelligence of cells, and how to manipulate it, how to communicate with it, how to study it. That's what I think they really are.
Cool. And Josh, before you talk about the like how to like make them do certain things, I just love that perspective, Michael. Like, okay, it's like this is really, you all are just like social justice activists for skin cells. It's like free the cells. They've been under the poor cells. They've been and they're being mean, and they actually they need to be liberated.
I love it. I haven't heard that take on it yet. That's great. I love it.
I guess liberate the skin cells.
We're gonna make some slogans in the lab tomorrow.
Exactly. You got to spread the meme. So Josh, now that we have these skin cells that actually are liberated and they're their own people now, or their own, so if you want to get them, I know like some of what I've read about Xenobots, and am I saying it right? Xenobots? I heard, or how do you say it?
I mean, I say Xenobot, but either way is okay.
What do you say, Josh? Do you say Xeno or Xeno?
Well, I like saying both because there's actually two meanings of the Xeno and Xenobot, right? There's the fact that these are made from Xenopus laevis, but Xeno is also the Greek cognate of stranger, newcomer, alien.
Xenophobia, kind of.
Xenophobia, yeah. Exactly. Okay. The xenomorphs from the Alien movies.
Okay.
So I think those two. It's good to pronounce it the two different ways to remind ourselves that there's at least two different meanings hidden in the name itself.
Good. So either or. So with these Xenobots, how I know that like you can get them to like push like plastic together, or like tell me, Josh, how do you get them to like do like to get them to do things?
Yeah. So okay. We can ask questions about what can we get Xenobots to do. We can also ask the question of what are Xenobots? What are they capable of? What kinds of forms can they take on? What can they do? If we're going to ask the question of what they can do, we can break that down into two categories. What can they do that's useful for people? So if we're going to focus on the bot part of Xenobot, that's why we make robots, or that's why humans make any machines, is they do something kind of on their own that's helpful directly or indirectly for people. So we mentioned in a couple of the papers, we just threw out some ideas that maybe someday Xenobots will collect microplastics from the ocean or chase down cancer cells in arteries. Those applications, they may arrive. It's not going to be anytime soon. This is a brand new technology. This is like computers in the late 1940s. No one predicted Tinder or Google Maps in the 1940s. It's impossible to say. So we can view the Xenobots as a brand new engineering tool, and it's a tool that was made by a tool. It was made by AI, which is itself a tool. what Mike has been mentioning, I think, is the much deeper implication of xenobots is we can ask the AI to design xenobots that are new scientific tools. They're like a new telescope or a new microscope that we might be able to pull new understanding of biology, mind, life out of xenobots more easily than we can from natural organisms. If you want a xenobot that chases down microplastics, you can ask questions like how big do they have to be? What shape do they have to be? How many have to be together? How do they have to cooperate? You can ask the same thing. If you want to learn new biology, what should that xenobot look like to be more conceptually transparent, to more easily give up its secrets compared to naturally evolved organisms? And I think going forward, that's something that the Institute is going to really focus on. It's going to be extremely exciting.
Cool.
I
Go,
mean,
Michael.
it's very interesting. What Josh was just saying, because these standard model systems, right? They lull you into a false sense of security because you see a frog egg and it's pretty reliable. It's pretty good at becoming a tadpole every single time. And you say, yeah, that's obvious. Yeah, right. What else would it do? We get it. The tadpole, acorns make oak trees and frog eggs make frogs, right? It's got to be. But the Xenobots have exactly the same genome as a standard frog, and yet they're not tadpoles. They're Xenobots. And so what it allows you to do is to question, right? It allows you to question, like, how much do I really know? What could I have really predicted? And the reality is, I don't know if this is a common knowledge, but given a genome, you can't actually tell anything about the shape of the organism, right? You can cheat and compare it to other genomes that you know what they are, and then you can sort of figure it out. But if you didn't know, you couldn't figure it out from the genome, nor could you figure it out if I shrunk you down to a tiny size and put you inside an embryo and you sort of looked around at what was going on, all the noise, the cells running around, all the stuff going on. If you didn't already know what embryonic development was and the fact that it was going to be reliable, there's no way in hell you would say, oh, I get it. This whole thing is going to make the same thing every single time and it's going to be a fish. You would never know that, right? At that level of, and so, you get lulled into this kind of like feeling that we know what's going on, but just because standard development is so reliable. And that's why I think using these synthetic models is so instructive.
Yeah, that's cool. It's kind of like a different version of like simplify. It reminds me a bit of some of the work that's happening with artificial intelligence safety and these transformer models, where what they're doing is they're simplifying and they're trying to do mechanistic interpretability, where they really look deep inside the system. And they say, okay, what are each of these different neurons actually like what are these little circuits doing? What's the attention layer doing? And they're actually able to look at and they, instead of looking, GPT-3 has 96 layers, and they're looking at 0, 1, and 2 layer systems. It's like making it very, very simple, getting kind of the mechanistic interpretability that you all are doing, and then being like, okay, now we can actually see what these things do, and when we combine them into more complex things later. But we shouldn't necessarily just take this super complex thing that looks simple from a standard model perspective, but is actually more complex. Is there a so let me understand one thing about Xenobots. So you get these cells. So what's the way to say this? Is there when you look at like pictures for Xenobot on the internet or whatever, you see this little Xenobot which has the skin cells and has the heart cells. Is the thing that makes it go? Is that like, if I wanted it to do something different, do I change? It sounds like you're not changing the genome. Is all you're doing changing the like arrangement of cells in like 3-dimensional space, or is what you're doing like doing some of these kind of biochemical, bioelectrical signaling? Like, how do you make it? How do we'll make these things do different things?
So ultimately, of course, there will be you could, on top of this, you could put everything. You could put synthetic biology circuits. We're going to, of course, do bioelectric signaling. We're going to do all that. For now, the thing to understand, and there's two kinds of Xenobots. There's the kind that is a bit of it has some it's got skin and then it's got some muscle, and what they do is, and they're sculpted to have these little legs and they sort of walk along, right? That's one kind. There's the other kind, which is just skin, no muscle at all, and what they do is they have these little hairs called cilia that beat, and they basically row and they swim, they swim through the water like a marine larva would. So the thing to keep in mind is that baseline, like most of the heavy lifting so far, is done by the cells themselves. Like they are already super competent in getting together with others. I mean, just think about it. We take these skin cells, we put them in a separate environment. what could they have done? Well, they could have crawled away from each other and just like been independent. They could have formed a flat monolayer the way that cell culture does. They could have died. They could have, there's a million things they could have done. Instead, what they do is they get together and they form this thing and they repurpose their hardware, meaning these cilia and some other stuff. They repurpose that towards new functionality. We didn't have to tell them to do that, right? This is what Josh was saying before about this is it's an agential material, meaning that you're not working with passive components. You're working with something that has an agenda. Cells like being next to other cells. They like forming sheets that are polarized in a particular way, right? And then everything we're going to do is on top of that. Then whatever you're going to do, let's say sculpt them the way that Doug Blackiston does, is when he sculpts these cuts away certain things. So what's happening here is that we work exactly the same way that evolution works, because evolution has to also work on top of this material. Evolution doesn't just get to pick all of the micro level details. It's already dealing with cells that natively want to do certain things. They're going to do certain things, and all you can do is come up with ways to modify. It's guided self assembly. All you're going to do is come up with ways to manipulate them, hopefully into doing something else. But you're not on a blank canvas. You're on this you're dealing with this very rich medium that in the absence of your clever manipulations is going to do whatever it wants to do, right? With it,
kind of reminds me of like a toddler or something, where it's like, okay, you have a toddler. The toddler wants to eat. It wants to run around. It wants to scream. It's like, you could, if you want to, you could try to get the toddler to like sit and like code something for a little bit, but like probably the toddler's just gonna like run around and be. So it's like it's an agential material, and so in some ways, yeah, it sounds like you kind of just like shove the stuff together and see like, oh, what is this agential material? And that's kind of that reflective perspective of long term. We'll try to make them helpful for humans, but short term, or I mean, we'll do both in both times. But like in short term, we're going to try to just understand what it wants, and so that is. I love the term agential material there. So and thinking about
you mentioned this metaphor about the toddler. We say in evolutionary robotics, the field that I work in, when you evolve or you get an AI to design a robot, it's like a teenager. It'll do what you want it to do, but in retrospect, absolutely not the way you wanted it to do it. And this exists all over AI, right? It's called perverse instantiation. And there's hilarious examples, autocorrect fails, and, tragic examples. There's been several human pedestrians killed by autonomous cars so far. And so, under all of AI and robotics, this huge global infrastructure and economic sectors that we are, calling into being on top of this technology, it's all sitting on top of technology, which will often perversely instantiate what you want it to do. This is extremely, extremely dangerous. Along come Mike and Doug Blackiston's Xenobots, which are different. They are materials that aren't stupid. If you try and put them together, they fall apart hilariously or dangerously, like when you're building with metals and plastics and electronics and deep networks and transformers. They self-organize. They do things that maybe you weren't expecting, but I don't know that they're necessarily always bad, right? We are biological systems. They are biological systems. There's general things that we both like to have happen. Hold your shape, don't harm anything nearby. Don't suddenly go out of control. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how or whether perverse instantiation crops up in xenobots and biobots and synthetic biology in general. Yeah. I think there's ways that it might offer us a path out of this fundamental impasse that currently exists in AI and robotics.
That's a really interesting perspective. Yeah, because like if you have so much of the issue with all of if we think about, this frame of like meta existential risk, where we have these existential risks for humanity, whether it's climate change or whether it's artificial intelligence and that becoming too intense and perverse instantiations there, or like, nuclear security. And we have, we went from 0 to 50,000 nuclear warheads in the world or whatever. Or if we think about biotechnology and the cost to, sequence and synthesize and create these kind of bio weapons or bio things. It's like all of those issues are things of like these exponential curves, while biology, as you're saying it has some of these kind of homeostatic or kind of self-chilling mechanisms into it. So it's like, hey, let's just like use these things that are more of a fit with the way that we want to be instead of doing these things that are kind of can get on exponentials too intensely or something. Is that right?
I mean, I'm not a biologist, but that
Yeah.
as a technologist, that's exactly it, right?
Yeah.
Nuclear warheads, all these technologies we've developed, they don't have the benefit of biological cells, which have had 3.5 billion years to figure out that you shouldn't explode. You should balance you should balance exponential processes against one
Yeah.
another, dynamic equilibrium,
Yeah,
ultimate
exactly.
stability, homeostasis.
Exactly.
That exists throughout biology, and we can just, that's maybe a safer foundation to build technology on top of
Yeah, cool.
than
Interesting.
what
Yeah,
we've
I
done
like
so
that.
far.
Is there so maybe taking a step back, and for both myself and for the listeners, if we imagine this, for me, I'm writing this book on what information wants, which is, the history of genes creating the biosphere and the tree of life, and then kind of memes creating this tree of ideas in the technosphere, both, factories, but also religions and things like that. And now we're in this weird place where we have the ability both for humans and these new kind of artificial intelligences to kind of rewrite the biosphere in these different ways. And whether it's like creating new xenobots or whether it's changing our DNA, how do you, and maybe starting with Michael, how do you think about how the biosphere is going to change in the next couple decades? Is it going to be, AI designed biosphere? Is that what we're going towards? Or how do you think about that?
I think that the biggest change that's going to come is which I think is going to blow up other things in a way that we haven't even begun to deal with all the revolutions that we've had so far, is that this distinction between basically a lot of terms that are currently thought of as binary. So a machine, organism, right? Robot, living thing, designed, evolved, all of these things which seemed like these were good terms that pick out natural kinds that were like truly different. All of that was basically just technological limitations. And now that those limitations are starting to be lifted, we're starting to see that those things are actually not sharp categories at all. In fact, for many of them, it's unclear whether there is something deep to it to be dug out, and what is that term really going to do for us at all? And so what we're going to see in the biosphere, I think, is basically I've got a beautiful kind of illustration of this that we're using in some of the papers where Darwin had this phrase, endless forms most beautiful, right? So he's looking out into the natural world and he's saying, wow, look at all the variety here, right? The actual space of possible beings is so astronomical that all of that stuff is a tiny dot. Okay, all the natural things we've seen so far is a tiny dot. And what's coming is every possible combination of evolved material, designed material, and software that you can imagine. One of the cool things about life is that it's highly interoperable. So cells from different species will live together fine. That cells will work with electrodes and with weird materials. They'll live on crazy scaffolds. And so what we're going to see is, and already you're seeing some of this: cyborgs, hybrids, novel organisms that have different materials at every level, from the molecular, from the DNA to the cells to the tissues, mix and match. Every combination that you can imagine is going to be created. And this is going to be very profound, because the whole notion of biosphere, right? We already have examples of parts of the biosphere modifying other parts of the biosphere, right? That's not new. Animals do this to each other. They change their niche. They deform each other, both on the lifespan of a single individual and, of course, evolutionarily. We do it all the time through our activities, even before the technological revolutions. But this is going to go exponential. And so every possible way of being an agent with highly diverse intelligences, diverse capabilities, different senses, different, these things are going to live in different spaces. So all of that is going to be part of our biosphere. We are going to have to learn to relate to creatures that don't share any obvious phylogenetic position relative to us, right? So we know what it's like to, you look at something and you say, yeah, that kind of looks like a fish. I know what fish are. I know what to do with this. There are going to be things where you'll be surrounded by stuff in your home, outside, everywhere, where you cannot tell what to do with it based on what it looks like and how it got here, right? Whether it was evolved or designed. And that's, that makes sense, right? We should have better ways of judging other beings other than what they look like and how they got here. And we are going to have to develop everything from frameworks to sort of gauge the intellectual level of whatever you're interacting with, and of course a new ethics for dealing with creatures where, again, you can't just put a line somewhere and say, okay, those are insects, do whatever you want, these are vertebrates, you got to be nice to them. Like, all of that stuff is going to just have a major meltdown. We're going to have to reimagine all of that.
Cool. Yeah, I love that overview. Josh, what do you think about the how do you think we're going to, if at all, rewrite the biosphere in the coming couple decades?
So I think it's exactly what Mike said, is these increasingly exotic creatures. And as Mike said, it's everything you can possibly imagine is coming, but it's more than that. It's also the things that we can't imagine. So there are, safe and useful machines / creatures that are deserving of our empathy that we can't imagine. Where are they, right? It would be great if we could call them into being. They're safe, they're useful, we learn something from them, they enrich our lives, but where in the morpho space, so where in the space of all possible things does it lie? That, from a technology point of view, that's the question. How do we tell an AI to go find it? Because if we can't imagine it, you got to catch 22. You can't go looking. So what we can do is take this very small point in the space of all possible beings, that is stuff we know about, which now includes Xenobots, and we can tell an AI to say, see all this stuff over here, head in the other direction, get as far into the morpho space, bring us back the most alien creatures you can find. If you can build with frog cells, genes, bioelectrics, chemicals, artificial materials, that's going to be really interesting. If we want to understand the space of all possible beings, then we need to have a way to navigate through that space and have the AI bring us back, interesting, useful instances. And so, what lies out there, it's going to be really exciting to see.
Yeah, that is, I like both of those things. And just to reflect a little bit, what I'm hearing is, that we have, and I love the framing. And I know, like, Daniel Dennett has a similar-ish framing where it's like, okay, you have, you can imagine the whole space of possibilities where, there are some things that are logically possible, like a horse with wings or whatever. And then there are things that are biologically possible. It's like, a horse with wings might work. And there's stuff like historically possible. Like, does that actually exist in the world? Does, like, the Pegasus exist? Not really, or whatever. And so you can kind of imagine, and then all these things have to somehow, if a being needs to exist, it needs to kind of, the survival of the, just rereading The Selfish Gene, it's like, it's a survival of the stable. And it's like this new thing in the morpho space has to exist for at least some period of time for us to, like, label it as a thing. And then that thing needs to kind of be stable and exist through time, and then obviously capture energy, or at least keep its kind of informational state or whatever. And so as we, what we've had thus far is just like this random, not a random walk, but this kind of energetic walk through design space. And now we're getting into the space where it's like, okay, it's kind of scary when you talk about it like that, but it's very exciting. It's like, okay. And I'm imagining, it makes me also think of the Spotify Every Noise at Once map, which looks at these 6,000 different genres, and you can and some of the stuff is normal. It's like, oh, here's Katy Perry, but then you can also be like, let's go as far this way as possible. And before long, you're listening to like Flemish metal, like 8-bit music, and you're like, what even is this? Who's creating this? And so I think what that looks like in the morphosphere will be really interesting, and it'll be really interesting to see that kind of, as you all said, like, maybe 100 years from now, or who knows how long, will just exist at multi-scales, with these new things that didn't really exist before, but are kind of are possible in the design space. So that that sounds cool and interesting. Any other reflections on that before we move into this final question?
You mentioned it's scary, and anything that's new is scary. But I think we are learning, of course, that we can make things or things can evolve that are dangerous to us. If we want to understand the difference between dangerous and safe biological systems, for example, we need to move through morphospace. We don't need to necessarily call all the things we find into being outside of a petri dish or outside of a computer simulation. But what does it mean in general for a living system to be dangerous for humans? or to be safe and helpful for humans. All we can do is reason from the admittedly limited number of organisms that currently exist or have existed. So I think a lot of the health challenges we're wrestling with, climate change questions, energy questions, we need to understand this better. In the space of all possible things and systems as they relate to us, what does it mean in general for something to be dangerous or safe and useful?
Cool. Yeah, Michael,
Yeah.
any other final reflections here?
Yeah, well, just to add to that, again, on addressing the scary part of this, one of the reasons that people often find this expansion of the possible scary is this baseline assumption that there are things that are natural and good, and then there are a bunch of these crazy scientists who are going to muck it all up by inventing something that's not natural and that's going to be scary, right? And so I just want to kind of remind ourselves that what we see around us in the biosphere is not the result of a process that had any of our values. In other words, what you're seeing is the result of a constrained random walk, right, through evolution. That basically, what does evolution optimize? It doesn't optimize happiness or intelligence or any of the things that we like. It optimizes biomass. That's it. If there's some way of staying alive and being observable in the future, that's what you got. And so I just think we need to realize when we get scared about making things that are not natural, we ought to be able to do better than that. Better than a random walk. We ought to be able to improve on things. And in fact, I'll go one step further and I'll say we have a moral duty to improve on things, because I think there are people who say, don't do stuff, leave it natural. To me, this is complete moral cowardice, because it assumes that, and I don't think that view is particularly viable anymore, that there is some way of saying that everything we see around us is sort of perfect. It's the way it's supposed to be, whatever that is, and then let's not muck it up. I think we look around at the suffering around us, both human and animal, right? Incredible, environmental challenges, medical. The emails I get every week are just unbelievable from people with medical challenges. It's horrible, and right, and this view that it's all natural, let's just leave it like this, is completely untenable from an ethical point of view. We need to be able to do better than blind evolutionary search. We just have to. So that's my take.
No, I like that. Well, it makes me think of, it's funny because when I say that, I'm like, a little bit worried about something. Like I'm like very open to experience. Like I live in San Francisco. I'm in like Burning Man, like some of my friends are like all that. Like I have you two on my podcast. And so it's like when I'm like triggered or whatever, that's how you're out. But as you said, it's like, hey, we need to kind of check in and see what is safe and what is dangerous within the morpho space. And also totally agree with you, Michael, to say that it's like we have the lowest, a really low bar that was set. It's like all that we've optimized for is biomass. Like we could do better. Like let's put our value. And it makes me think of like this wild animal initiative, which looks at the 10 trillion animals in the wild. It's like, okay, how should we help them or not help them? If so, it's like, can we make a world that actually has our values kind of baked into it in this different way? So that's an exciting future. So as a kind of a wrap question, in the last kind of 5 or so minutes here, I guess I kind of want to ask, both of you a version of this, but, I think that, and especially, I'm thinking about, seeing the world as this kind of, complex systems and through the lens of complexity and informational processing and that kind of thing. That's kind of it's kind of a weird lens. It's kind of complicated, but then once you start to like taste it, it's very delightful and juicy, but it's kind of hard to get into it. So maybe starting with Michael, how did you kind of get into this lens, or what would you call this complexity kind of informational processing lens? And do you have any like advice for listeners on how to go deeper down that rabbit hole?
Yeah, and it's hard to do it in a couple of minutes. If anybody's really interested, drop me an email and I'll kind of point you along. The biggest thing that I think we need to do is there's a phenomenon that I call teleophobia, and it's this idea that people are and we're taught this in classes. We're taught to be terrified to overestimate the amount of agency in whatever system, right? So the goal is, let's treat everything like the simplest possible machine we can. And woe be you if you attribute something more to it. I think that's fundamentally wrong, because it's just as bad to underestimate as it is to overestimate. Okay, and a lot of people won't agree with that, so that's controversial. But that's what fuels the work that I do, which is that, and that we all do together, is that you need to get it right, not just head blindly for the lowest, for the lowest possible level of description, because that's where you think, you're a kind of reductionist. I mean, not really, because you don't really want to talk about quantum foam all day. You like chemistry, and so we'll just do everything in terms of chemistry, right? It's just like that's what people like. But I think I think you need to realize that you could be wrong in either direction, and what's important is to get the right level, the optimal level of agency for a given system, not just to assume it's low. That opens up all sorts of avenues.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, Josh, do you have any other advice for kind of interdisciplinary thinkers on the podcast for how they kind of traverse their career in these or other adjacent fields?
I mean, when I was a student starting to learn about all these various fields that we've kind of touched on, the thing that over the years I've absorbed from it is that it's an inherently optimistic way of viewing the universe, because it asks the question, what is possible? And often it's in a literal scientific engineering point of view. What's possible with frog tissue in the case of the Xenobots, right? And then you get to these bigger questions of what's possible in morphospace, the space of all possible organisms, machines. And then it leads you, when you start to think about those machines interacting with us and our infrastructure and our planet and the planets in the solar system, then you start coming to, social and philosophical questions. What is possible? Like Mike said, there's huge amounts of suffering. Can we do things differently? So you're coming to, a social and philosophical deep question, an important question, but you're coming at it via science and engineering. You're grounded as you approach these big questions. It's not just political platitudes and let's make a great planet, let's stop climate change, but I have no idea how. So I think there's something fundamentally optimistic about AI, robotics, synthetic biology, interdisciplinary work that's really trying to ask this question, what's possible, and get those options out there, and then let us as a society decide where do we want to go? What do we want to try?
Beautiful. Yeah, I like both those. It's make sure you get the right level of agency in a system, and even using the term just like the agentic material, it's like, how agentic is it? That seems great. And then also, the what is possible reminds me of like a David Deutsch perspective here of like, sustainability is not necessarily good. You don't just want something to just continue as is. It's like, what can we actually make good in the world? Like let's go and make something possible and exciting. So with that, thank you both for coming on the show. For listeners, if you want to just check out Xeno, just like Google Xenobots, and I'll put all of this in the show notes, Xenobots. And then also on Twitter, they both have great Twitters. Michael is Dr. Michael Levin on Twitter, and Josh is Dr. Josh on Twitter. Both doctors, so that's good. And I'm not a doctor. So thank you again both for coming, and thank you listeners. And we'll work towards this new morpho space. That will be exciting. That sounds fun. Thanks.
Thank you, Rhys.
Thanks very much.